We're thinking about character here, and I'm going to look at two of the authors that we're examining in the course, Angela Carter and Dorothy Allison, to kind of think about how childhood gets depicted, and does childhood become a quote-unquote scary story within these writers' work. Basically, within the depiction of character in fiction, character develops in various ways. The most common ways in which a writer develops a character is through the character's physicality and environment. So you have a mix of the character's inner world, the character's thoughts, history or backstory, as writers will say, and then the character's outer world, the character's appearance and the way he or she speaks, the actions that the character takes, and the social world or environment through which the character moves, and also the ways in which the character inhabits particular spaces or travels through certain spaces in the character's development. Those are the most common ways. A central way of developing character, though, is through conflict, that the character is engaged in various battles with others, with self, with society, with environment, with even God. And the character is locked into these battles, and as the character defines him or herself, the full aspects of the character emerge. Writers will think about this in terms of what is it that the character wants. As you look at each story, kind of like as you read, think about what the character's central want is here. I like to think about this in terms of the story's economy. What is in short supply in a story, and what is the character willing to trade to have that thing that's in short supply? Is the character willing to trade parts of his or her integrity for something else? Also, you can think about the points of obsession or desire that the character feels within a story, to kind of think about how irrational aspects of our psychological makeup define us as human beings, and how these kinds of things figure into a writer's depiction of character here. Now, against that, here we're going to look at one of Carter's rewritten fairy tales, and then we're going to look at a contemporary short story, and think about how in fairy tales how characters can seem kind of flat sometimes, or they want just one thing, and it's not very complicated in the end, or is it maybe a little more complicated than what we give them credit for as we hear a fairy tale? And in what ways does that flatness within the fairy tale character's world, in what ways are there aspects of horror to that as well, perhaps? So you take something like Cinderella. The way that the stepmother treats Cinderella in that story is awful. If it was a contemporary, if it was a moment of contemporary life, she would be investigated immediately for the ways in which she treats her stepdaughter. But in what ways do we allow that in fairy tales to kind of sort out the good from the evil as the story kind of unwinds and tells itself? Angela Carter complicates that sense of fairy tale in her story, In the Company of Wolves. So you'll start to recognize the story's development from the very beginning. But she uses very kind of common tropes within the fairy tale to engage us as readers. There's a familiarity or a closeness to the character in the fairy tale that we connect with them instantly, that they bring us back into the ways in which we heard fairy tales as a child. So when you read this story, you kind of are forced to kind of rethink your own engagement of Little Red Riding Hood and how she exists in your memory from the first time you heard that story. Secondly, as a character, the wolf here is itself want personified, right? That the wolf is defined by hunger, and the wolf is defined by desire. As Carter writes, the wolf is a carnivore incarnate, that the wolf is cunning as he is ferocious. And so the wolf is all about want. What he wants is Red Riding Hood, and to devour Red Riding Hood. And we'll see how complicated that becomes. There are other tropes of the fairy tale here too, and some of which also kind of get reimagined in contemporary horror stories as well, or horror films, and you'll note these kinds of things. That, as Carter writes, you're always in danger in the forest where no people are. The forest is a place of of subtlety and danger for characters who enter it. That it's not a place of peace, right? That it can be when we walk through the forest, or we go through natural landscapes today. Instead, the forest is always a space of danger and uncertainty. If you stray from the path for one instant, Carter writes, so the character is kind of set on a path, and any diversion from that path is reason for trouble or complication. And then Red's innocence here is interesting too, right? That the characters are either good or all bad within a fairy tale. That Red is completely innocent in the ways that we imagine her. In Carter's writing, the forest closed upon her like a pair of jaws. And one of the tensions in this story is how Carter complicates Red as a character here. She starts to play with the fairy tale's form and the fairy tale's meanings in the ways that we recall it. So from the very beginning, Red is not only this innocent girl, but is a strong-minded child who wears this red shawl. The red kind of marks her in various ways. Does red as a color, do you associate that color with innocence? So the fairy tale kind of offers a more complicated young woman within it from the very beginning. That Red is a character of potential violence, right? That she carries a carving knife in her basket, and so that possible violence that comes from carrying the weapon becomes part of who she is as a character. And then Carter adds another dimension to Red as a character, as she knows she's just started her woman's bleeding, the invisible pentacle of her own virginity. So Red is both innocent and is potentially not innocent from the ways that we think about her as a character sexually from the very beginning in Carter's tale. The tensions within this story as they develop come out of Red's desire to dawdle. As Carter writes, she forgot to be afraid of beasts. She wanted to dawdle, and so as she meets the woodsman, and she's drawn to the woodsman in some ways. And the wolf approaches, grandmother's house and eats grandmother, and then gets into the bed and waits for Red, and then the exchange that you recall from the times you heard the fairy tale, what big eyes you have, and finally Red, what big teeth you have, and the wolf answers, all the better to eat you with. And at that moment in Carter's story, the horror shifts a bit perhaps, and at that moment the girl Red burst out laughing. She knew she was nobody's meat, and she gets into bed with the wolf. Snow light, moonlight, a confusion of paw prints. See, sweet and sound she sleeps in Granny's bed between the paws of the tender wolf. And so the characters have kind of been inverted here in some ways, right? The wolf who begins carnivorous and full of desire is taken down by Red, one who seemed innocent at the beginning but is more complicated in the end in Carter's retelling of the story. We can kind of come back to the question of innocence and how it works in a contemporary story versus a fairy tale. In Dorothy Allison's short story River of Names, from the very beginning of the story you have kind of an invocation of innocence, an exploration of how you think about childlike innocence. From the first sentence, at a picnic at my aunt's farm, right? So this kind of pastoral space, familial space is recalled by the narrator from the very beginning. As she will tell, we were so many, we children, we were without number like tadpoles. And so this kind of like invoking of childhood memory as a space of, quote unquote innocence is a great part of the story here that will develop in some strange ways and some interesting ways as the character develops here. Part of the center of this story also is the narrator's relationship with Jessie, her lover, and so you also kind of get an indication of the love story here, is what its form, what you expect from it as a form. There's an edge to it in some ways, right? The two characters trying to kind of explore their relationship and the boundaries of that relationship and how they understand one another, and a kind of playfulness that's there too. As they lie in bed talking, as the narrator says here, I lie to Jessie the way I always do. So there's a you know a kind of not deceitful lying, but also maybe kind of a sense of storytelling as she kind of unwinds her past for her lover, Jesse. Later, sleeping but not sleeping, I rolled away, but I didn't cry. So she's trying to figure out how she places her relationship with Jesse in a larger story of herself against her childhood. And Jesse smiles and says to me, "You tell the funniest stories." So Jesse, hears these stories of the narrator's childhood and reflects on the innocence of them, and tries to think through the violence of them as well, and tries to place the narrator in that space. As the narrator here, she recalls a child's life. She comes face to face with the violences there against children, the sexual violence against children here, the levels of addiction within her family, and the various traumas that come out of these things. And thinking about the violence done to children here, she recalls, if there was one less from time to time, who counted? They died and were not missed. And so these large families of the American South that she recalls being a part of, how violence was almost a regular thing within her memory of growing up. In terms of sexual violence, she recalls, almost always we were raped, my cousins and I. That was some kind of joke too. What's a South Carolina virgin? And as the narrator says, that's a girl that can run fast. And so there's kind of a joking aspect that's part of her family's understanding of the children's experience of sexual trauma. And when she thinks about addiction, and she kind of goes through all the substances that she recalls her family using, her cousins and extended family using, she thinks about it all worked to dull things down, to pass time, that the sense of a grinding kind of monotony of childhood is dulled down by these substances. So addiction is another kind of level of trauma that the narrator recalls. It's interesting in this story, right, that how the narrator tells these things to Jesse, and how she has her own kind of personal ways in which she understands the stories and their importance to who she is, and then the ways in which she presents herself to Jesse. And in the gap between there's this interesting kind of psychological distance that develops within the narrator. In what ways is she able to speak about the past, and how does that kind of unveiling of the past change her through the story? What parts is she forthright about, and what parts does she kind of conceal from her lover? As Allison writes, there's such mystery in having survived. Am I supposed to say something, do something, be something? So she's still kind of cooling, right, as a character. She still hasn't kind of worked out how these traumas have impacted her in the end. And she says, I tell the stories and it comes out funny, right? The awfulness of these stories is almost comical in the way that Jesse hears them, right? That nothing could be this bad, right? In the ways in which we think about trauma today, how do you tell a terrible story? Is it possible to even imagine this here? And so a lot of how this story comes out depends on how you as a reader respond to the narrator. Much like the Carter fairy tale, how do you respond to the narrator and her past here? How do you accept it? Or how do you hear it? How do you engage it? And in terms of your own personal experiences here. So as she says near the end, I would like to tell Jesse I got a dust river in my head, a river of names endlessly repeating. That dirty water rises in me, all those children screaming out their lives in my memory, and I become someone else, someone I have tried so hard not to be, but I lie. And that conclusion of the story, complicates this narrator further, right? In what ways does she tell you the truth about the past? In what ways can she tell you the truth about the past? And how does that impact your sense of the character's innocence? So we look at these two kind of, these two stories of childhood, one a fairy tale, one contemporary short story. How does your sense of the character emerge here? How does the sense of a complicated character emerge within these tales?